All right. Hello. Welcome. Can you hear me, Joti?
I can hear you.
Very good. Oh, that's one down. Let's see. Oh, okay. And I'm not too bright. One time, just as an aside, the first time I had this circle light, I didn't know the settings, and I looked literally like I would burst into flames if I hit sunlight. So I'm always out of the crypt. Anyway, welcome, Joti Brar, to Morbid Symptoms. I'm Tara Van Dyke. Nice to meet you in person.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, and I've had your comrade Alexander McKay on a couple of times, more than a couple of times. You always have good fun when I get him to be laser eye Alex on bad trot takes and that type of thing. Anyway, to get right into it, let's see. The inspiration for this and why I wanted to have you on is, I'm sure this is, nothing new to you, but there's this thing called the left. Does it exist? I hear about it all the time. There's the faux left and the real left and the far left and the center left and the Democrats and the Labor Party and the Green Party and the DSA and the this and that and the other. And, I've heard that if your Marxism isn't for trans liberation, then you're not a good Marxist, or you're not a good feminist, or you're this and that and the other. And of course, Sultana, and I'm going to try to keep my examples UK based as much as possible, but as you can tell, I'm a Yankee. Anyway, so I was very happy when I reached out to Joti, and I'm like, can you come on and can we kind of sort out, like, what is this left? Is leftism keeping class politics behind and that type of thing? And I was really glad when you said, sure. So anyway, if you could just tell our audience a bit about yourself. I know that you're Joti Brar. I know that you come from a communist lineage and that you're a member of the Communist Party, Great Britain, Marxist Leninist. And when you do your little intro, if you could let our audience know why it's important, why you guys felt the need to break away and add the Marxist Leninist to your party.
Sure. So, yes, my name is Joti Brar. Yes, I was born to communist parents. It is not an automatic transition from having communist parents to being a communist. I have said to many people, and I say also to my children, there's no such thing as a reluctant communist, right? It's something you have to study for and become on your own. The head start that I had was I happened to be born to very good communists. And when I decided I wanted access to the knowledge they could give me, it was right there. I didn't have to spend decades, as so many people do, floundering around in the left, wading through all the wrong ideas to find the right ones. That was really lucky for me. Right? I'm very appreciative of that. But yes, I am a communist. I joined the movement, and so I grew up around the movement, but I joined it for myself just over 30 years ago now. So I've been being a communist full-time as an activist, as well as a student of Marxism for just over 30 years without a break. So, not
a fair weather communist.
And it was an odd time to become a communist. And you can tell that I had good role models in that they doubled down on their Marxism at a time when everyone else was abandoning it. So that's the legacy of my father, Joti Brar, is that in the 90s, as the Soviet Union was collapsing and in the aftermath of that, he became a pillar not only in Britain of Marxist theory, of explaining that it was revisionism that collapsed, not socialism, that real Marxism, Leninism is still the key to our liberation as humans from capitalism and from imperialism. He wrote a series of really important books, first looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union and then looking at various other kind of key ideologies that get in the way of working class liberation, like social democracy, like Trotskyism, like bourgeois nationalism, right? So all of these very important aspects of the struggle, he was very acutely aware of, studied deeply, and had been active in the movement himself since the mid-1960s, right? So our party rests on a deep well of Marxist theoretical knowledge, but also practical experience. And of course, Gopal and his close comrades, which included my mother when she was young, they were trained in the movement by people who were old in the movement themselves. So again, they're part of a kind of continuous legacy. We didn't just kind of pop out of nowhere. Our
and put some iconography in your bio and be like, let's take it to the man.
Yeah, right. So our party, the CPGBML, was founded 21 years ago, but it was the fruition of a lifetime's work, really, of my father and his close comrades. They had been in a very small organization of communists, but they had been involved in a lot of mass movements. So they were involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, the Zimbabwe Liberation Solidarity movement. They were involved in the women's movement in the late 60s, early 70s. They were involved in the anti-racist movement. My dad was a key leader of the Indian Workers Association for several decades. So they did mass work as well as kind of trying to build a real communist organization, but it was a very difficult period to build a communist organization.
Yes, and I want to just stop a couple of places, because one of the things that I'm hoping to get out of this episode is that a kind of a guide to bourgeois versus proletarian left politics and ideas for the confused. Yeah. And so what I want to, before we get into into more detail about why some of the things you mentioned are problematic or that get cobbled under this thing called the left or leftism, have actually been counterproductive to the types of things that you were just talking about and the tradition that you come out of, communism, Marxist, Leninism. That really quickly, when you talk about, let's get this out of the way for the vocabulary, revisionism, reactionary, when you talk about revisionists and reactionaries, and also I think we should get at the beginning for a good kind of axis, Trotsky or Stalinist.
Okay, sure.
Or and as always, feel free to take whatever, to presume I said whatever allows you to make your important points.
No worries. So revisionism is basically a trend that has existed always within the Marxist working class movement. And it basically consists of people who, usually because they're actually aligned with the bourgeoisie in some way or another, want to revise the teachings of Marxism to make it more palatable to wider society, i.e. to the ruling class. And what it usually means is taking out the revolutionary content. So revisionism in the Soviet Union is particularly epitomized by Khrushchev, the actions and ideology that were promoted by Khrushchev after he came to power on the death of Stalin, which basically meant starting to dismantle the dictatorship of the proletariat. So you had rule of the party, and the party became a separate elite from the rest of society. That wasn't how it was before then. There was a steady undermining of Marxist-Leninist education for the masses and a steady separation of the party from the masses. It stopped being their party and became a kind of ruling clique. There was a purging of the good Marxist-Leninists from the party during the Khrushchev period to facilitate this, enable this to happen. And economically, he started the beginnings of dismantling the socialist planned economy and bringing back commodity production to the Soviet economy, which was the beginning of creating the conditions for the collapse of the Soviet Union, which took a long time to collapse. If you think those first moves were being made in the mid-50s, and the Soviet Union didn't collapse till 1991, you can see how much of a strong economy had been built before then, that it was a slow process to undermine it. And key to all of this process, and this is something about revisionism generally, they always present what they're doing in the name of Marx, in the name of updating Marxism, or just, Khrushchev used to say, oh, well, we've achieved everything we needed to achieve, and now we're just marching forward to full communism, and even the people, Gorbachev, when he was doing the last bit of dismantling of Soviet, planned economy and Soviet proletarian democracy, did it all in the name of Lenin, right? So this is something that is you see consistently, and it was something that we've been seeing really since the death of Marx. People using Marx's name to justify all kinds of aberrations and deviations from Marxism. So we call that revisionism.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
And just to get back there, I'm sure we see similarities in any kind of movement, even though there seems like when you hear the left or the right, what gets placed is like all the, for lack of a better word, I don't want to get too academic, but there's a lot of internal contradictions and antagonisms and kind of hegemonic battles for what who's going to be kind of this custodians of the legacy? How are we going to reinterpret the past theory and practice and in terms of the present and the future and all that stuff? That there's always these battles going on that when we hear about the left or the right or the whatever, they get kind of all jumbled up. It's fair to say. I know that I've had that experience.
The ruling class does a good job of presenting a narrative about the communist movement, like these people just can't get along, they don't know how to agree, they're just they're split at the drop of a hat. In actual fact, a lot of the splitting has been a result of capitalist infiltration of our movement, which of course goes on all the time. It goes on by provocateurs, but it also goes on by the battle of ideas. It goes on through the vehicle of people's minds. We are all of us vehicles for bourgeois ideology because we've grown up in a bourgeois society and we are surrounded by bourgeois propaganda. So if you are not conscious of what is a bourgeois, idea in your mind, and where, spontaneously all kinds of ideas seem to arise in your mind that aren't that spontaneous at all. They are a reflection of the propaganda you're surrounded by. And that's why, the importance of studying, but also the importance of the group to be able to help you. If you're a sincere person, a sincere Marxist, you need sometimes help to recognize when you are getting attracted to wrong ideas because they've become fashionable and they're in the air and they seem like a good idea. Fundamentally, we have to recognize Marxism is the science of the proletarian, the working class struggle. And we need it in order to win, in order to get rid of capitalism and imperialism and build socialism. And socialism is just the working class as the ruling class running society in its own interest without a class of parasites who basically sponge off all the wealth and keep the workers in misery. So it's a planned economy, which just means we work out what we need and how to produce it, and then we distribute it accordingly. So these are the basic foundations of what we're all about.
And if I could just to flag something, because somebody, I don't know if they're watching or not, but somebody responded to the post I put out on X for our talk today, and was pushing back on me, like, because my thing is this left-right binary is problematic, because you could have, I would argue, one of the things I think is that you could have the left-right of proletarians and left-right bourgeois in terms of especially cultural practices and ideas and whatnot. But this person said, well, I go, he's like, why would you push bourgeois and proletarian categories that don't even match any that have long since stopped being meaningful representations of our like economy? And I thought, and I just said, well, I go, you should tune in tomorrow, and I will definitely put that up at the front, because sometimes when you get used to this vocabulary, it doesn't even. I forget sometimes that this will sound really 19th century or 18th century if we're talking about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So if you could write at the beginning, because we're talking about the broad things now about determining if something is proletarian or bourgeois in content or form. So if you could just say a bit about that to this person, that au contraire, these are still very meaningful categories that do reflect material processes in particular. Not to put words in your mouth, Joti.
No, 100%. I would really appeal to people who've bought into the idea that this is all somehow something very historical, to actually read Marx's Capital, read Lenin's Imperialism for yourself. They're perfectly approachable books. There's not some kind of mystique about them. You've been encouraged to feel like, there's a big barrier between you and that, precisely because the knowledge is so powerful. But what is a proletarian? A proletarian is someone who lives in the capitalist system and has no means of production with which to feed himself and his family, and therefore has to sell his labor power to an employer in order to eat, pay his bills, take care of himself and his family. So is that not most of us? Right? That's what, if you sell yourself for a wage and you have no other way to feed yourself, and if you didn't have a pay packet for a couple of months, you'd be destitute, you are a proletarian, right? The bourgeois are the owners of the means of production, right? They are people who have enough access to enough capital that they can use that capital to employ others to make them still richer. That's the basis of the capitalist society. If you read Capital, you can get a fantastic lesson in how that developed, what it developed out of, and what it's developing towards. And that's one of the key importances of Marxist science, is it doesn't just show you the origins and the development and the workings of capitalist society. It shows you also the contradictions that capitalist production for profit creates and cannot solve. And it shows you the solution to those contradictions and the direction in which capitalist society is taking us, which is towards a planned economy, right? And this is the result of scientific investigation. So it's not some air dreamers went, wouldn't it be nice if things were nicer? Wouldn't it be good if we were kind to each other, if the world was fair? It's a genuine, and again, I can't explain it all to you in a couple of sentences, but if you
no pressure, this is just the amusement.
If you read Capital, you will see for yourself how it's a scientific, and there's several volumes of Capital as well, not just volume 1, but the writings of Marx in general show you that this is a scientific study, and that Marx discovered scientifically laws which are operating within capitalist society, which capitalist society cannot overcome. You can't reform these laws out of existence. They are absolute laws in the operation of a society which is based on commodity production. That means producing things for sale on the market in order to realize a profit. That's the basis of the economics of our society. And we know this when we look around. Nothing is done unless someone makes a profit out of it. It doesn't matter how much we need it, right? And we often rail against that it's so unfair, it's unjust, it's unequal, our society. And all those things are true. But there's no point just complaining whilst trying to fix it inside the boundaries of capitalist society. And that's what Marxism teaches us, but it also shows us the solution. Hence, and if I can just quickly come back to the very opening part, as I was explaining, where my party came from, we are students of Marxism who've understood that. We've understood that it's the working class's job in history. Our historic role is to replace capitalism, which has done everything useful it can do for humanity and now just holds us back. It's the working class's job to replace capitalism and imperialism with socialism, with the planned economy, with the working class as the new ruling class, right? This is the job, the historic role of the working class. And in order to fulfill that task, it needs people who dedicate themselves to helping them understand that, to connect to studying Marxism and connecting Marxism with the mass of the working class so they can do the job that history has assigned to them, right? And so that is what we are. We are people who've dedicated our lives to that study and to that purpose. And there have been times, of course, we lived through the period of the fall of the Soviet Union when the bourgeoisie was very triumphant and telling everybody, communism's dead, it's over, it's a failed experiment. But increasingly, people are realizing that's not the case. All the contradictions of capitalism and imperialism are coming back. The workers and oppressed peoples have indeed, as Stalin predicted, he said back in the 30s, what would happen if the Soviet Union fell? He said the workers and oppressed peoples of the world would be seized by the throat. That's exactly what happened, right? We have had austerity and worse conditions, even for workers in the West, in the richest countries. In the rest of the world, they have had their national liberation struggles overturned. They've had war after war after war. It's very difficult for countries to attain and maintain sovereignty without being endlessly targeted and strangled by the imperialists. Nevertheless, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. When people have known liberation, when people have known sovereignty, when people have the ideas in their mind that they need sovereignty and independence, they're going to keep fighting for them. So
if I could just, I think maybe one of the, because I didn't push the person too much. I just, probed a bit, explained what I meant. But I think, do you think one of the problems is that if you have, maybe you could say a bit about this. You have the most important division or class antagonism for capitalism is capital versus labor, or bourgeois versus proletarian, in terms of the politics and the mindset. Now, a lot of people, and I'm assuming this person, has a problem seeing themselves as like a factory worker or a logger or a farmer or something like that. And when I used to be back in the day before I got, when I was still in academia, what I would do is like, okay, well, imagine, and I didn't come up with this, like everything in your room right now, or everything that you've used or consumed today, where did it come from? Both who made it, like, and literally like where, So there's the production and there's the realization and there's the distribution, all of that. And I think that some of us, because we, if everything that you need, you pay money for in the commodity form, you get kind of, I guess, maybe the alienated. And that would be why these concepts of literally like, well, I'm not a proletarian and I'm not bourgeois. So I guess we could talk about maybe in between phases, as I understand it, when I try to explain it to myself and others, is that you have the main structure, which is proletarian, bourgeois, labor, capital within capitalism, that it's working itself out back and forth. But then you have things like the middle class, petty-bourgeois, intellectual labor. Some people in the States really like to have this barista argument, barista producing value, productive versus unproductive value, these types of things. So I'll stop rambling on there. And if you could basically speak to that, because I think maybe that's why people have a problem. They can't see like, well, I'm not, Bezos, and I'm not working in the Amazon factory. So where am I in this?
So fundamentally, things get obscured because we live in an imperialist country, and an imperialist country which is so far into its decadent decay and parasitism that very few of us any longer are engaged in productive labor. As you said, all around the world, people are engaged in productive labor and producing the goods that we're using every day, right? Mm-hmm. Probably all came from China.
Yeah.
But still, if you are a wage slave, if you need to sell yourself for a wage, right, as I said earlier, you are a working class, you are a proletarian. But there's a couple of caveats. So there is a class called the petty-bourgeois. Petty-bourgeois is someone who has a means of production, a small business, or back in the day, it was like a small farmer or a handicrafts person who had the tools of their trade and used them
podcasters.
Tools of their trade that they used to make a living, right? Mm-hmm. And those were petty-bourgeois. So they're not exploiting somebody else. But they're also not selling themselves directly for wages. They're selling the products of their labor in order to live. So that's the classical definition of petty bourgeois. It used to be that the professional classes, which were very small because the number of people who could access the professional classes was tiny also. They kind of serviced the ruling class. They tended to be petty bourgeois. So if you were a priest or a lawyer or an accountant or a doctor, you had a practice, where you had your highly qualified trade and you plied it to the rich, and that you were kind of a petty bourgeois. Well, what we have now is, because of imperialism, we have the growth of something that he called the labor aristocracy. And that is a section of the working class. Yes, they're working for wages, but they're not working for minimum wage wages. And the reason really is that they are receiving a few crumbs from the table of imperialist super profits to give them quite a privileged existence. And they have a distinctly higher standard of living, higher wages than the bulk of the working class. So Lenin identified this in imperialist countries, a very distinct set of people who actually had different interests, because their better standard of living came via the super profits of imperialism empire around the world. They tended to be loyal to imperialism and look down on the mass of the workers. Right? And what Lenin also identified was that the leadership of the working class movement around the turn of the century, if not earlier, had basically come under control of these people. And it's the reason we see consistently in imperialist countries that trade unions, anti-war movements, socialist parties are all being led by people who fundamentally don't want to challenge the capitalist system and the imperialist system. And they keep the working class under control, and they make sure that their activity doesn't lead to anything truly disruptive. And fundamentally, it's why, our party's written extensively, my dad did a lot of work on this, on the Labour Party's role as a party of imperialism, right? It's sold to us as the party of the working class. You are muted.
Thank you. There was the sirens, and I thought maybe they were coming to get me. No. And I was, just as a joke, I was telling my husband, because of the immigration stuff going on, and even though I'm not too worried because we're all bright white, but my kids are mongrel, American Dutch, and I'm like, maybe I should finally get one of those DNA studies, because my mom's maiden name is Wallace, and so then I could be like, look, I got some at least 25% Scottish in there. Anyway, sorry. I wanted to flag that, just what I said when you mentioned that is just to flag in terms of people keeping score at home. Labour Party, not proletariat in content or really much in form. There's some words, there's some aesthetics, but I just want to flag that. But we will, when we get to the rapid fire part of our segment, Jeremy Corbyn will pop up, and as will Keir Starmer, and we'll see Joti,
So Lenin characterized the Labour Party back at the time of its earliest formation as a bourgeois Labour Party. And what he meant by that was, it doesn't matter what its mass membership is made of. That doesn't prove that it's a working class party. What would prove it was a working class party would be if it had working class ideology guiding its program. And he said the Labour Party has a thoroughly bourgeois program, and it doesn't matter. You can put as many flat hats in the leadership as you like and as many coal miners in the membership as you like. It's a bourgeois party for the bourgeois system. And that's something that really confuses people. So let me just get it out there now to frame our discussion. This left-right paradigm and kind of spectrum that we are presented with, very neatly curated to us, is the left to the right wings of bourgeois politics. Proletarian, working class politics, the pursuit of our own class interests, is outside of that paradigm. It's not inside, it doesn't fit in it. And that's why also it's not covered. Right? You never will see my party getting referenced on the BBC. What they present to you as extreme left is Trotskyism. And they're right. Trotskyism is the extreme left of bourgeois politics. Right? So this is something that's very important to understand. They all serve the imperialist capitalist system, extreme left to extreme right. They all have the same ultimate program, which is save British imperialism. That's something that has to be recognized. So a lot of the differences are very much cosmetic. They're kind of to keep you on side with some team that's been presented in such a way that you feel that you identify with it. The right
Coke or
colors,
Pepsi, tea or coffee, milk or cream.
Yeah, all of that. And cultural so-say differences, which are not really very deep differences when you kind of scratch the surface, but you're encouraged to feel are really different. The same way, people from towns next door to each other are encouraged to feel like they're rivals and really different from each other when they're basically the same.
Okay, Joti. So you mentioned imperialism, and let's define that a bit. So when you say that a lot of what gets put under the left, whether it be the Greens, the Lib Dems, or the I don't know, almost said Tory party, but Labour Party, etc. My understanding is that the main export of the UK is capital. In particular, it used to be a mix of commodities and cash or finance capital, but now more and more the main export that comes out of the UK is capital that goes invests around the world, and they want a return on that investment. So a lot of the foreign policy, and then that affects the local policy, is about protecting that investment. They want to make sure they get as much return as possible, which of course I don't want to answer for you, but I imagine that has something to do with the foreign policy and Greater Israel and Ukraine, maybe.
100%. So imperialism means war. There's no way around it. When you say they want to protect their investment, you're absolutely right. But it's not like protect it as in, oh, make sure we get, we don't just lose our money. The whole point of export of capital is to raise profitability because the home market has become saturated. The home market becomes saturated because the people have been impoverished. You've been expanding production and impoverishing the working class. That's how our capitalism works. And at a certain point, you have a problem, which is you're producing all these goods, but the poor workers can't buy them off you. So you need to expand. And profitability gets lower and lower inside a kind of contained economy. I mean, the reality is there was never a contained economy for the whole of capitalist period. But, kind of theoretically look at it that way. You have to expand. You have to find new markets. For 200 years, the capitalists in Britain, they had the first systemic overproduction crisis of capitalism in 1820. And that crisis has been recurring every 10 years, pretty much ever since. And each time, part of the strategy for bringing back profitability was expansion. And it was expansion outside the borders of find new markets, find new people to sell our stuff to, right? Well, then you have a global market at a certain point, and the global market's saturated, and the global people have got too poor to buy your stuff. So they stopped just exporting goods, and they're constantly looking for ways to bring back profitability. And one of the ways is to get people in poorer countries to make the stuff in the first place, because their wages are lower, the prices of land and raw materials is cheaper. So what happens is you take the capital you've amassed at home, you take it to Indonesia or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or Vietnam or wherever it is, you set up your factory there, you employ local workers, you control the government so they're not taxing you and they're not requiring that you take care of the environment when you're, doing your industrial processes and poison the land and the rivers and the air, and no one can stop you, right? And you can put the workers there on absolutely pittance slave wages for the local level of existence, which is lower. So that maximizes your profits. So the whole point about imperialism is maximum profit. Right? You maximize, and then you bring that wealth. So the local people created all that wealth for you, and you bring it back home. So they get nothing. They get to stay in poverty. And your whole policy is about making sure they stay in poverty. Don't let them unionize. Don't let their governments get independent, because they'll start holding you to account. They'll want some of that wealth for themselves. You don't want to give it to them. A big part of it is controlling sources of raw materials. And again, the imperialist economic imperative is get those raw materials for as cheap as possible, preferably for nothing. What is all the wars in the Middle East are because oil is the most important global commodity, and to control supplies of oil means not just that you can make a fortune because it's so important, but also you can stop other people from having access to it, your rivals. Which is also a kind of imperative of the imperialists is to try to choke rivals by denying them access to vital materials, like, of course, energy.
Well, and just to flash that in terms of the hypocrisy or the how either happily or with resignation, people have to act in order to reproduce the system that you're just talking about, and it gets talked about in great ways: human rights, development, overseas investment, all this stuff, and I'm sure it's not all diabolical, but one thing I think is interesting is because you mentioned the Middle East, is that the Congo is not oil rich, but it's very rich in all the stuff we need for all these, everything that I'm using right now, all the tech stuff and the batteries. And that's a war-torn place with warlords and this and that. But for whatever reason, everybody who we would put under the left, the kind of NGO, professional managerial, inclusive diversity, all that stuff, and the feminists don't say blip really about the Congo, but they're all about Afghanistan.
They don't have to, because it's almost not in the news. And this is one of the ways that bourgeoisie controls things. Now, if workers in Britain had more direct connections with workers in Congo and were seeing feeds like we're seeing from Palestine of what's happening there, it would be much harder for the ruling class to keep the lid on its crimes. But it's a perfect example, actually, but to look between the difference between genocide in Congo and genocide in Palestine and how they're perceived by workers. You see, with Congo, you see the same pattern that the ruling class has had for centuries, which is simply hide information about what they're up to abroad. And the mass of people just don't know. And when the mass of people don't know, then the leadership of their movements can turn a blind eye and nobody's going to call them out on it, right? I actually was part of a group, even before we founded our party. We were in the SLP those days, Socialist Labour Party, with Arthur Scargill, which we were in for quite a few years. And then at the time of founding our party, we were working with a Congolese comrade trying to found a Congo Solidarity campaign in Britain, in London initially. We could not get any interest from the wider left. They did not care. They did not want to know. And already in that time, we were talking about, the genocide of 4 or 5 million people just in the latest phase of, what you talked about, the Coltan Wars, essentially. Somebody dubbed them the PlayStation Wars, right? The war that was ravaging Congo so that the imperialists could get their coltan basically for nothing. And the left didn't want to know because there was no demand from the wider masses because it wasn't in the papers, right? So you have this kind of, they do this ballet, if the wider masses start to become aware of something and outraged about it, then their leaders and some of the papers have to reflect it a little bit so as not to be totally exposed. But if the mass of the people are totally unaware of something, then their leaderships will be complicit in keeping quiet about those things. Like, oh well, no one cares,
And I think it's also not to get on the psychological, because this is maybe a confession on my part, kind of out of sight, out of mind, and we love all our devices, yeah. And so if every time and I think about this sometimes, I'm like, I'll be like, oh. Yeah, it's just really complicated. And then I think I don't want to get too far off into this, but just kind of the laundering, or I guess this would call what Marx would say we're kind of ruled by abstractions, is that, well, what, I go to the store, I buy this lovely product, I have a great experience, I come home, I'll look at the packaging, and maybe they say, 1% of the profits go to helping Ecuadorian coffee farmers. I don't know. And I think, oh, well, I mean, you don't really know you're allowed not to know. It's easy. Everything is kind of encouraging you not to look too carefully about the history behind these products that for a lot of us, we can't even imagine being gone, even though I'm a Gen Xer. So I had spent most of my life without a cell phone and whatnot. But I think that's part of it. Do you think that's part of just the guilt, especially when it comes to the stuff in our devices?
I think we are deliberately kept inside a kind of bubble of, on the one hand, kind of isolation, and on the other hand, distraction. So it's very, very difficult for workers who grew up in Britain and whose parents were British to really understand what is imperialism, because they haven't experienced it. They've lived all their life inside this protected bubble. They've been told, they've been raised with a kind of supremacism that expresses itself in very nice ways, church do-goody type of ways, but fundamentally has taught them so that they just feel it in their bones that their society is just a bit civilized and people around the world are a bit incapable of being properly civilized. And those messages are given to us so many different ways. And all the problems of the world, if we're exposed to them, it's in this kind of like, as if Britain was a innocent, helpless, a sad bystander to terrible tragedies. And who knows why it is people do such silly things around the world, like they're always fighting and they're always poor and they seem to be very corrupt. And isn't it a shame? And let's have a charity drive and, send them some jumpers or whatever. There's a total disconnect. And this is where the destruction of a decent communist movement really comes in, because without the communists, you don't have anybody helping to break this kind of information wall and cut through the distractions of the bubble. And even though people are now becoming much more angry and much more aware of how many things are wrong with this society, it's still very hard for real communist voices to cut through, because we are, you know, deliberately kept separate. We are suppressed on social media. It's very hard for people to find us. You know, we're not invited into the media. We're not mentioned. In fact, there's a deliberate policy of not mentioning the name of our party in mainstream media. And including, when I say mainstream media, I'm actually including alternative left media, right? Who are officially left out, excluded from the official left, right? There's no Palestine solidarity campaign, big meeting or rally that's going to invite me to speak on the platform, although we are the best anti-Zionists in the country, right? There is no Stop the War platform or conference that's going to invite me to speak on its platform, although we are the best anti-war activists in this country. We're the ones who've got an actual program for the working class that tells them what they could actually do to stop a war, what they could do to stop the genocide. We're deliberately excluded from access to the mass platforms and the mass audiences so that people could hear what we've got to say. So we have to fight very hard, and consequently, ordinary workers have to struggle hard to find us. You know, so it's both directions. It's hard work for us to come together. Nevertheless, we find that our influence is growing, because in the end, the truth comes out, right? And I just wanted to come back before I forget it. You were talking about how there seems to be constant struggles inside parties, inside the left, for kind of whose line comes on top. Something that really has to be borne in mind about all politics, but particularly in Marxist politics and working class politics, is every trend inside the party actually has a class interest behind it. And the key to understand, so people come from all backgrounds into the party, and they will bring with them a whole load of prejudices that they've picked up. And the skill of building a good Marxist movement is to be able to recognize the class interests that a certain line represents. Now, what we have that really helps us in these days is this job has been done for us by very intelligent people over many decades and even centuries. So what you will tend to find is very often a line that's presented to you as something really new and exciting, and this changes everything. If you've studied enough Marxism, you discover that it's a repackaged version of something we've seen before. So like anarchism and green politics were basically, when they were shown to us as, this is a big new thing, actually it turned out to be repackaging of somebody who Marx dissected and took apart ideologically, Proudhon, back in the middle of the 19th century. So if you study enough, you're able to recognize how old wrong ideas, which smuggled bourgeois ideology into the working class movement, are being constantly repackaged for new people who haven't come across them before to be confused by.
And I wanted to when you now I know what came to my mind, because I know that, of course, the Capital Volume 1 and Lenin's book on imperialism, Volume 2 and 3 are a bit hard because, you know, they're unfinished works. But I wanted to say also the Grundrisse, because you mentioned Proudhon, and the Grundrisse is a great read because Marx will cut a Mitch, so to speak. And when he's critiquing people like Proudhon and whatnot, sometimes it's kind of funny how he really, you know, and also some of his journalistic writings, it's like, well, he was very critical of lots of genres of socialism, I guess, back in the day. So okay, so now I forgot did you have a point you wanted to finish? No, or are we good to go? Okay, so let's see what I have here with my cheat sheet.
Oh, hang on. No, you asked me a question earlier. Let me just finish it. About why our party called itself CPTB.
Or here's a great meme, which I think is great for leftists, but as I understand it, at least when a Marxist party is running well, you don't tend to have as many guns pointed at each other's backs. But I'll let you do with this meme what you will.
I literally don't understand it. What's it saying that we all?
Okay, so it's a leftist, and there's a leftist behind a leftist with the gun, and there's a leftist behind that leftist with the gun, and then there's a leftist from the balcony pointing at all the leftists with another gun. So it's kind of like you know, they're just all backstabbing and complaining and.
I mean, in terms of the
of
actual violent shooting of leftist by leftist, invariably what you find is that a revolutionary movement gets infiltrated by the forces of imperialism, and then internecine warfare breaks out. And we've seen that in many countries and many movements, and it's, you know, it's always tragic.
Of course, I think this guy probably meant it like just bitching wise and
we just do a lot of
canceling.
bitching. Yeah. So, well, that side, I think, just comes back to what I was saying earlier, which is the class struggle exists inside the party as much as it exists in society. The party is itself a microcosm of society, which is trying to build a disciplined working class organization out of members of society. And the class struggle, the struggle for the right line that's going to lead to success, going to lead to revolutionary transformation of the society, is a hard struggle. And it goes on, as I said, inside the party. It's sharp. If you read the life works of Lenin, more than half of it is directed at, probably about 3/4 of it, in fact, is directed at wrong trends inside his party and inside the International Communist Party. And that's not because he was just some kind of bad-tempered, you know, permanent bitcher.
My way or the highway.
It's because he was a real scientist of Marxism who really was determined to help the Russian people achieve socialism. And he was exposing, in the eyes of the workers, as well as in the eyes of people in the party who were wavered and weren't sure, why all these people were selling them lies, selling them ideas that would lead to defeat, right? So those wrong ideas have to be exposed in order for the working class to take the right path and win. And if you're not just a faker and a poser, of course, if you're serious about winning through to socialism, you've got to take this fight seriously. The class struggle is a very serious struggle. And sometimes it takes the form of word. In fact, most of the time it takes the form of words and ideas and helping to educate people in how to spot which are the ideas which are going to serve them and which are the ideas which are there to distract and derail their struggle.
Okay, and thank you, Joti. I want one clarification before we get into some of the things that are really quite clear. If someone is, they could think they're proletarian, but in practice, quite not. And then we'll move on to our lightning round and our rubric. That's exciting. What I wanted to ask is, or not ask, but make clear is, it goes back to people who hear this bourgeois, the bourgeois proletarian binary, or class conflict, class structure, and to realize that you don't have to be an actual proletarian to have a proletarian politics. I mean, Marx wasn't a proletarian. Doesn't mean I don't know. I don't know the whole thing. He had an Engels. Engels had money. Engels helped him out. You know, but you don't, to make clear that you don't have to be an actual, I mean, it's great, you know, but that you don't have to be an actual proletarian in your day or night job to have a proletarian politics, or vice versa. You can be quite, you know, work for wages and have very little control over what you do and how, either at work or in the broader economy that you live in, and have bourgeois politics. If you could say a bit about that before we move on to
totally. Well, there are class traitors in the ranks of every class, but there are also core class interests. The core class interest of the bourgeois is to keep the capitalist system going so that they can carry on exploiting. The core class interest of the proletarians is to overthrow capitalism and establish socialism, right? So proletarian politics are socialist, revolutionary socialist politics. Bourgeois politics is everything which keeps the capitalist system going. An understanding that proletarian politics are the politics of humanity and humanity's future can come to anybody. And in fact, the science of Marxism was created by a bourgeois intellectual because, and he said it himself, this theory is necessary for the effective class struggle of the workers, but the workers are not in a position to produce this theory because it requires a level of education that's not available to them. Right? So the bourgeois, initially, proletarian ideology came into the movement from outside, from intellectuals like Marx and Engels. What happened then was it was embraced by the most class-conscious workers, and we got this thing which we called worker intellectuals, right? So working class people, once the theory had been provided to them, could pick it up, could study it, could take it on board and use it. It could empower them in their lives and in their work. So now, when we have the important work of Marxism has been done for us, and our job is to use it for our struggle, we don't have to have, you know, a separate strata of intellectuals doing that work for us. Any worker, and especially in the modern world where we all read, you know, we're not in the days of Marx when, you know, a huge section of the working class was illiterate. We have enough education, all of us, to access proletarian science if we want to. It's all about motivation, to be honest with you, and determination. Of course, there are barriers. It takes a lot of effort, but it's, you know, it's worth it. It's because it embodies truth and it's so powerful. But you can identify yourself with the cause of the proletariat from any class background, of course. And as you say, there are plenty of people in the ranks of the proletariat who unfortunately identify themselves with the ruling class, who think of themselves, and my brother likes to say this, as if, and it's particularly common in America, so many workers have imbibed this idea of the American dream, that they are, despite their poverty, that they're just kind of temporarily embarrassed millionaires, you know, and any day now they're going to make it, and therefore the system's there for them.
Yeah, or I mean, this is getting more dicey across the West, but also people who are homeowners think they're capitalists or something, and it's like, well, and especially, I mean, you know, and it's great if you have your home outright, great, but a lot of people have a mortgage, but still, it's this idea that, again, I think that's part of the buy-off, is that, you know, the ownership society, then people become very concerned about the resale value of their home. And that kind of aligns them with, you know, like, oh, I have the same concerns as, you know, BlackRock, or,
well, they've got a stake, you know, in the system. Yeah.
Whoever.
Yeah. It's very illusory, isn't it? You know, this little tiny bit of property. Even if, like you say, you manage to pay off your mortgage, it's still very insecure. So you get old and you get, you know, you need care, and you probably have to sell that home, liquidate some money to pay for your care costs, because you own a home. The government will say, well, we're not paying your costs, you've got money. You know? Yeah. So in actual fact, you know, people scrape and save and try to, you know, they pay exorbitant prices just for the privilege of having a roof over their heads and feeling like they've got a stake in the system because they own something. But, you know, usually what they own is a debt to the bank. And when that's paid off, they get to a point where then they start to find they have to liquidate it, either so that their kids can have deposits for somewhere to buy, because they can't possibly save a deposit because it's too impossible, or to pay, like I said, to pay care costs. So actually, you know, it was just a way of keeping you busy your whole life and making you feel like you were building something that in fact wasn't yours at all.
Yeah, and I want to stay on track here. I'll just flag for people that under Joti's name, you can see the communist.org. You can check that out for to put more meat on the bones of what she's talking about. And also, she's had 2 recent podcasts on Savage Minds, and also you can go to Proletariat TV, and I think you do a regular show with Garland Nixon, who gets into more of the current imperialism of it all, and the wars and whatnot. And also would cover things like communists are not against you having a home, and kind of just has dispelled the myths and smearings. So I would encourage people to go check that out, because I'm not gonna make her go through all of that again at this point. So this is what I'd like to do in the next, I think we have about an hour, give or take. We'll see how this plays out, because, you know, on paper it's one thing, and then practicing something else. So if we've already covered it, I'm not going to make us go through it again. But what I wanted to do is get some, again, kind of things about, if people are wondering if even their own politics or whoever else is proletarian or bourgeois or some sort of mix, you know, what that's trending towards. Start off with some things that are really kind of clear to distinguish people and policies and institutions, and then maybe go into kind of a rubric of what you can look at to distinguish or to plot something, even yourself or your thinking on this spectrum, for lack of a better word, and then get to the fun kind of lightning round, where I just put up a picture and Joti gives her, like, you know, proletarian, bourgeois, whatever. That's the idea. So the first thing that's kind of one of the things about the fake left that gets thrown around, real left, fake left, faux left, this left, that left, is NATO. Can you be a proletarian and former content and F with NATO, so to speak? Would you say?
So you just sorry, I might not quite understand what you mean. You mean support it?
Yeah. And anyway, so like Paul Mason, the Ukraine is a good example.
Yeah,
so the Ukraine thing has divided the quote unquote left, whatever that is. So is NATO in any way a proletarian vehicle, even accidentally?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Joti Brar, my father, used to describe NATO as a neo-Nazi alliance. It's an aggressive instrument of war that is wielded by the collective West to keep the rest of the world in line in order to keep maximum profit flowing to the owners of finance capital. That's its job. It exports violence and genocide all over the world. There is no aspect of NATO that is in any way progressive or proletarian.
All right. So why do so many people have the Ukrainian flag who would say they're left or trend left or really left, but Putin, Russia, yada, yada, yada?
Essentially, what they're showing is the co-optation of the leadership of the working class movement by bourgeois politics, and how in the West the labor aristocracy is so tied to the interests of imperialism that they will cheerlead for the interests of imperialism almost louder than the ruling class themselves, right? They are desperate to prove their loyalty. And this goes all the way back to 1924. The very first Labour government was only in power for about 8 months, but it was almost like a trial run where the ruling class is kind of, all right, give it a go, let's see what happens. And minister after minister at the top of that administration said openly, we want to show that the empire is safe in our hands. This very first 1924 Labour government, that was explicitly what the leaders of that government were saying. The empire is safe in our hands. So this is why our party has always made clear that the Labour Party is one of the chief enemies of the working class, because it's like the wolf in sheep's clothing. You know, it's easy to know that the Tories hate you, right? It's not very easy for workers to realise that Labour and Tories are basically the same thing with different branding. They're both mechanisms for maintaining the class rule and the imperialist interests of the British imperialist ruling class, the financiers, right? The monopoly capitalists who are sending their money abroad, as you said, and getting their returns. And Russia is an impediment to British finance capital and American finance capital because it insists on sovereignty. It's this huge territory full of people and resources that the imperialists want to hyper exploit and loot. And Russia has the cheek to say, well, we'll happily be your partner on the world stage. And the imperialists are like, you haven't understood this relationship. You're supposed to be the servant, right? And the Russians are like, we're very happy to trade with you. And the imperialists are like, we don't want to trade with you. We just want your stuff. Right. And there's this, you know, the Russians are like, well, why can't we all just get along? And the imperialists are like, you don't get this relationship. Right. And so fundamentally, you know, and you have to see all of this as well. It's not like it's business as usual in one sense, but there's also there's a bigger driver, which is that the global monopoly capitalist economy is in a massive, massive global crisis. They are desperate to save the system, which is teetering on the brink of a massive meltdown that will put 1930s in the total shade, right? And they're trying to find ways to restore profitability, to make a quick buck, and it's got to be a big quick buck. What they want is the looting frenzy they got at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, which again rescued the imperialist global capitalist system from a deep crisis it was in the 1980s. Right? They were rescued from that. They got like what I call a shot in the arm from looting the collective wealth of the socialist bloc, former socialist bloc. They want to do that again with Russia. Russian government and people are standing in their way. So this is the origin of all this Russophobia that we see in our society. It's not a kind of endemic thing that Russians and English can't get along. And it's not that, there's something awful about Russians. It's literally the present Russian government stands in the way of imperialist looting, and they need that loot. And not only does it stand in the way of their looting of the vast territory and resources and peoples of Russia, but Russia is also acting because of the position it's found itself in, where it's been like, well, we're not socialist anymore. Why are you still targeting us?
Yeah.
Because you won't be a colony. They're like, we don't want to be a colony. Well, you have to be a colony. So they're like, oh, well, to be sovereign, they need allies. And increasingly, to bolster their position and keep the majority of the world's people and countries on their side, they've been, and also to keep their people motivated and mobilized for the war against NATO that's been forced on them in Ukraine. They are leaning more and more into their Soviet past, which means giving help and support to nations around the world who ask for it on a fraternal, friendly basis, right? Not an exploitative basis. They're not new imperialists, right? But they've made themselves hated to our ruling class because of that, because they're getting in the way of imperialist domination, not only of Russia, but of other parts of the world too. They're helping other sovereign countries stay sovereign or get sovereign and defend themselves. So, of course, the imperialist ruling class hates them, targets them, wants to bring them down, and is obsessed about bringing them down. But you see how the labor aristocracy is so aligned with the system that they take on the hates of their rulers almost more vociferously than the rulers themselves. The rulers themselves might have a kind of, now and again have a calm conversation about Vladimir Putin, but you'll never find a labor aristocrat who can say Vladimir's name without pulling a face and spitting, right? And they have allowed themselves to fall for, or they've justified their position. I mean, some of them are part of manufacturing this nonsense. Some people just fall for it because it sounds convincing. Other people are working in the machinery of manufacturing this nonsense narrative, which tries to say that Russia is a new aggressive imperialist power in the world. And so they use the terminology of socialism and hide behind it. But, if you imagine that NATO is out there, to defend countries that are being aggressed against by imperialist powers, you've been living on a
promoting free speech and freedom of association.
Right.
and voting. You can vote as long as you vote right.
Yeah. So they use the aspirations and the sentiments of working people, which are against war, which are against imperialism and domination, which want fairness for countries and for peoples. Fundamentally, we have all of us as workers, in fact, imbibed a lot of socialist principles since the October Revolution happened in Russia in 1917, to the point where when the imperialists are doing their dirty deeds, back in the early 20th century, they would openly say what they were up to because they were just superior and better. Since World War II, all the imperialist machinations, they've had to present them in a narrative as if they're good socialists, right? We want to free women, we want equal nations, we want, they wrap everything up in the terminology of the oppressed and the aspirations of the world's majority. But increasingly, it's wearing very thin, isn't it? Their hypocrisy becomes more and more evident.
Okay, and on that note, let me do a follow-up. The UN. What role does the UN play in this kind of post-World War II late-stage imperialism system? Is there anything proletarian about the UN in former content?
In form, there was something progressive about the founding of the UN, which was, it was basically the result of the balance of forces after World War II, which was essentially that there was this rising socialist world. The socialists defeated the fascists in World War II. There was a rising socialist world. And
Americans did, Joti. Sorry, go ahead.
And the imperialist world had to reckon with this. The imperialist world was very shaken. Apart from US imperialism, every other imperialism was either almost totally destroyed or on its knees, right? Only American imperialism had the strength to resuscitate and prop up the rest of the imperialist powers, which it did to make it look to the world's people as if there was an international community of families and not just one dominant imperialist power, right? So they sort of, in the interest of keeping global capitalism going, they kind of helped to resuscitate imperialist powers otherwise, like France and Germany, which were essentially had been defeated by the course of the war. So you had that post-World War situation of a rising socialist camp, and because of that, the imperialist camp was on the back foot. They were having to make huge concessions to their own workers in terms of the welfare states and housing and education, all these things, to buy off the revolutionary sentiments of their people and keep capitalism in place, because otherwise it was just going to be socialist revolution all across Europe, right? That was the mood of the masses at that time. So they were on the back foot, and the balance of class forces globally and the advance of socialism meant that the United Nations Charter had to codify a whole load of principles which were the demands of the colonized and the oppressed. Now, the truth is that the United Nations has never, ever been an instrument for implementing its own charter. But the charter exists. And increasingly what you'll find is, as anti-imperialist powers grow in influence in the world again, they endlessly point to the UN Charter, and the gap between the UN Charter and the realities in the world, and the fact that the basically US imperialism has a total veto over any action by the UN. So all the actions of the UN have actually been aggressive actions. They were giving a United Nations cover to imperialist wars. Where they haven't been able to get cover through the UN for their wars, they've just gone outside the UN and done it anyway, coalition of the willing, etc. Right? The Soviet Union walked out of the UN at the time of the launch of the Korean War because it became clear that the UN was not going to be able to be used to arbitrate in a proper way and resolve this dispute, that the imperialists had got enough control of the structures to be able to use it and manipulate it. It wasn't an honest forum. So they walked out, and as a result, the Korean War was waged under a United Nations flag, and 14 countries were able to be corralled under the US's banner to invade and genocide in Korea between 1950 and 1953. So the United Nations essentially is a tool of US foreign policy. That's, it lives in, it gets most of its money from the USA. It lives in the USA. So the USA can gatekeep who can come and go from the UN. The USA can bug everybody who works at the UN and pressure them and blackmail them and do all kinds of things to them. And the USA can veto anything it doesn't want through the UN. So fundamentally, it is not a proletarian institution, but the UN Charter has been a useful propaganda tool in the hands of the oppressed to say, look, you agreed to all this, you signed up to all this, and it helps them to expose the hypocrisy of the modern imperialist way of conducting their aggressive war, which is to pretend they're doing it to protect people rather than just for naked interest and profit.
Yeah, well, I know, and I always forget that the United Kingdom doesn't have a constitution. Of course, they have lots of laws and traditions, but I know that it's the same thing that's gone on in my country for a long time. Is that people will be like, "Well, look at this fine document."
Yeah,
Declaration of Independence, Constitution. Hey, what about us ladies? What about us African Americans? What about us this, that, and the other? So it's able to be like, which is obviously. I'm not going to say that the founding fathers were proto-socialists or anything like that. But as a segue to the related thing, human rights. In terms of this kind of a bourgeois proletarian form and content, I think this one's a bit more dicey, although the critique of them is not that in of themselves it's fine, but that it's very based in liberalism, and again, gets kind of used as a cover for all kinds of things like humanitarian wars and interventions and humanitarian sanctions and humanitarian bombing and all kinds of things. So so Joti, human rights,
if your definition of human rights does not include the right to a job and a home and the right to live free from exploitation, then they're not human rights. It's just hypocrisy, and it's a propaganda cover for capitalism, and to pretend to fool people into believing that there's a way for capitalism to deliver fairness, equality, kindness, dignity. What are all these things here? Peace, dignity, rule of law, and prosperity. Prosperity for whom? Capitalism cannot deliver prosperity for the masses, because it impoverishes the masses in order to enrich the few at the top. So this is just a con trick, right? But it's also, it's a mantle that the ruling class has taken on itself, like I said, as a cover for its really genocidal and barbaric control and looting of countries all over the world. And I think we have to be very grateful to people like Netanyahu and the Banderaists in Ukraine for pulling the mask off and showing us what is the true content behind all of these hypocritical words.
Well, and also, I don't want it's that you could have fascist human rights. You could have of course, bourgeois human rights. You could have, I don't know, child sacrifice cult human. I mean, all. So what I mean is that there's some sort of master term or signifier that gives meaning to all these things. And this has come across. I've been thinking a lot about this. I don't want to get too far off track, but we might have to have you back to get into the proletarian versus bourgeois feminism. But whenever I'm pushing back on imperialism, a feminist typically will pop up and be like, you don't care about women's rights in Iran, you don't care about women's rights in Afghanistan, you don't care about this, that, and the other. And I'm all like, and you can imagine the follow-up. And to get back into just the education of it, and this woman probably meant well. I don't want to get too long, but there's all this stuff that's come up unsurprisingly since the Gaza thing kicked off. The genocide kicked off, about the plight of the Afghan woman. Yeah. And it's going on and on. And I was getting in this interaction with somebody like, well, the best thing you can do is to, if you're in the West, is to tell the powers that be to leave Afghanistan alone so they can sort this out. Right. And also, sorry, not sorry, the Taliban doesn't give a crap what you think about their gender policies. I'm not a big fan, assuming all of it's true. But this woman said, no, what we want, we're just trying to raise awareness and to raise the voices, because again, this kind of white women's or Western feminist burden. And so the UN, and this literally is a quote, so the UN will do something.
Do what?
Yeah. I mean.
Yeah. So, there's two sides to that, aren't there? One is this seeing, and it's a very chauvinist mindset. That, as you say, the white man's burden, white woman's burden approach that says these victims need me to speak for them, and that's how their problems will be solved. So it's seeing the world like your Lady Bountiful dispensing charity, right? But people don't need charity; they need liberation. Now, the liberation for the women of Afghanistan is twofold, and the first and most urgent part is getting the imperialists out, right? Because dealing with the local problem is much less of a difficult battle, and in order to create the conditions for the women to be emancipated, you first have to lift off, the thing that's holding everybody down, and then what you actually have to recognize, the Afghan women aren't so bloody stupid, because they actually had that until the Americans came. They had the beginning of a socialist republic in Afghanistan, and women's rights were flowering and blossoming in the mid-1970s in Afghanistan, and you can see photographic evidence of that if you want. And it was the USA who paid for and developed extremist Muslims of the type who didn't exist in Afghanistan before, right? They created this Wahhabist type of movements that and fundamentalist movements. They armed them, they made them into big movements where before they'd been like, just kind of Jehovah's Witnesses wandering around looking at people's doors and everyone going, whatever.
Well, yeah, just as a flag there to bring back the Mujahideen, and I'm sorry, people who know how to say those words, I try my best. Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden. And then you have al-Jilani, and Jilani is like the reverse bin Laden, right? So bin Laden first was like a freedom fighter. He's great. He's fighting the communists or whatever. or not. I mean, he's the one we know most about because of September 11th, and then became a terrorist, and we know his fate. And then you have Jelani, which started off with, I guess, Al Qaeda, ISIS, and now is the leader of Syria, whatever that is, and shaking hands with all the fine civilized people like Mark Rubio and Keir I'm sure all of them. I'm sure you saw the pictures. So I just wanted to kind of flag that in terms of these things that seem new and crazy, or kind of, I mean, not exactly the same, but repetition. But I was just thinking about that Jelani's the reverse Bin Laden.
Both of those are, are tools of imperialist policy in both of their incarnations, whether they were being terrorists or whether they were being, freedom fighters or, leaders. They were serving imperialist ends every time. And just to come back to the question of women, fundamentally, again, you need to study Marxism to understand that the real liberation of women, all women, including the massive working class women, can only come about through the ending of class society, which means if you really care about women's rights, you've got to join the fight for socialism. Not go around the world saying, oh, I've got freedom and those poor women over there don't, right? You're obviously coming from a position of privilege here in Britain. The reality is massive working class women are still suffer, even in the West, where we officially have all of our rights, under the double burden of, class exploitation, but also gender oppression, because as women, we are expected to do a whole load of unpaid labor in the home for the family, raising children, caring, and it keeps us, under an extra burden. We're providing a social services without support, in fact, being penalized for the fact that, and society relies completely on all this labor that women perform for free, and they have to be kept in their place, so they keep doing that, right? And it's only socialism that can change that situation. The origins of women's oppression go right back to the very earliest class societies. They didn't begin with capitalism. They began with the slave owning society, actually. When men became the owners of private property, they also became the owners of their women folk, right? And this has a long, thousands of years history, and it's only socialism that can finally resolve it. And that is why anybody who really wants to liberate women should join the communist movement, the socialist movement, the struggle for a new socialist class-free society, right?
Yeah, as important as the burqa is, and all that stuff. First things first, and I hope we can come back to get more into the women question, because I just, in terms of the kind of the bourgeois, whatever you want to call it, bourgeois feminism or imperialist feminism, maybe that's a synonym. But so many times they'll be like, oh, we just want women to have more choices. But usually what that means is a choice is a choice, and a good choice if it's the choice I would make. And they keep on making these wrong choices, and supporting their men, and not wanting to forsake, the most terrible cultures on earth from the point of view of J.K. Rowling, perhaps. Anyway, good. I want to, because such a rich conversation. So I just want to basically get through a bit of the rubric, if we want to be like position to ourselves, our thinking, a policy, a person, a party, a trajectory in terms of completely bourgeois, completely proletarian, or something in the mix. And we already talked about this before in terms of the left and how it's a very contradictory entity. One of the things I think would be, oddly enough, if we have a left or right, a left or right bourgeois, is anti-communism. So I know you know a lot more about this. I just want to tee it up to the fact that after the fall, of course, there was the communists or socialists or Marxists. That's also maybe talk about how those things go together. In the West, after World War I, came under increasing pressure. But then, of course, after World War II and the Cold War, and then my understanding is in France, for example, after 1968 was a big watershed moment. And you have a big divide in the quote unquote left between communism and anti-communist left. as well as, which I think probably goes along with, an imperialist to anti-imperialist left. And if you, whatever you want to say about those two things in terms of the proletarian former content of what we would call, parts of the left.
So again, I would distinguish between bourgeois left and real proletarian politics. And I think one of the difficulties we have is that these, in the bourgeois narrative, these are constantly conflated, but if you're really understanding the spectrum of politics, I would say that our party is outside of that, because we see the whole of this left to right spectrum as representing the enemy class. And we are representing the mass of the working class, even if they don't yet know it and haven't yet identified themselves with us. We know from our study of Marxism and our understanding of history and everything else that we are representing the real interests of the mass of the working class, in contradistinction to this entire gamut of left to right, bourgeois, petty-bourgeois political spectrum. So there's that. When people look at this, what they think of as the left, and they see this whole mess of liberal, essentially most of what they think of as left is left liberal. And liberalism is the ideology of the capitalist class. It's the ideology of the individual. It's the ideology of individual self-actualization, and the left liberals, actually take this to kind of extremes, whilst simultaneously having a kind of socialist sense that things should be fairer. Right, but they try to solve the problem of the unfairness and inequality, which is endemic, intrinsic to capitalist production relations. They try to find a solution to that inside the bounds of the system that creates that unfairness, and they try to find an individual solution to these problems. If I have equality before the law, if I have equal opportunities, but you can't really have equality even before the law, because the law is such a biased instrument, and if you have more money, you have more access to the law, and if you have no money, you have no access to the law, right? Like with medicine and loads of education and loads of other things. There's this illusion that the bourgeoisie propagates amongst the workers, that they have choices that they don't really have. Fundamentally recognize this when people are talking to you about choice. Do I have the choice to go and earn a living? It's like, well, you have the choice to be employed by somebody, to audition and get somebody to employ you and exploit you, or you can starve in a ditch. That's okay. That's your choice, right? It's not really much of a choice, is it?
And just on that, I wanted to elaborate, because my son is 19 and he's trying to find a job that he still has the home safety net. So if he really hates something, he'll just be like, I don't want to go, Yep. Tried McDonald's for a while, etc. But also just at basic level, or I don't like the word like no skill jobs. I think that's kind of nasty expression, or minimum wage jobs. But even then, they want 2 or 3 references. They want to screen you. They want to give you these tests and all this stuff just for the privilege of working at a fast food restaurant or stocking a warehouse, a working warehouse. I'm not poo-pooing on that stuff, but it's just like, but you're getting the same thing. Like, there's idea that there's jobs aplenty, and anytime I want a job, I can just go out and get a job that's a good match for me and fantastic. When it's like, I don't know. I just wanted to throw that in there because it was just amazing to me that even at a basic entry level job, they want all this stuff, and no one can say like, well, F you. Why do I have to jump through all these hoops?
No, you have to. You don't have a choice about that. You have to audition on your knees, and you have to show yourself. You have to try to prove to a prospective employer that you'll be a good lackey, right? And that's what they're auditioning you for, right? Can you write a sentence, or can you present yourself, or can you say the kind of things that will make me think that yes, I can rely on you to be, to know your place.
Or to ask somebody, can you tell me why you really want to work at McDonald's? Why you really want to work the midnight shift at the DHL?
I'm really motivated.
Be really excited about that. You can't just say, well, I need the money.
They want willing prostitutes.
I'm willing to do this. I mean, But yeah, I'm sorry. I guess this kind of demoralization.
You have to sell yourself, and they kind of train you to do that like it's normal and natural. But you don't actually have a choice fundamentally. And I guess the welfare state and some level of safety net in the West has hidden some of that from people. That there has been a fallback mechanism for some decades, but that was an anomaly, and that is being taken away. So we are much more returning to what things used to be, which is you don't work, you don't eat. And many times during economic crises in the past in Britain, people starved to death in large numbers, right? And that was just the normal workings of capitalism, and their ruling class would justify it by saying, oh well, there's too many of them. Clearly, if they're not all employed, it's because there's too many, and it's just nature's way that a bunch of them will starve.
And on that note, do you think we could maybe we already have something similar? We just call it something different. But I know there used to be like poor houses and pauper houses and like all kinds of things. That usually got, from the bourgeois point of view, or the WASP point of view, as we say in the States, that kind of focused on the moral failings of the working and poor classes. But I wonder if we could even, do you think we could get something like that? Or is that really, or we're not there yet, dystopian thing? Like,
I wouldn't be at all surprised, Tara. Or they just find a different way to kind of do the same thing and give it a different label. But, I had a comrade who used to point out quite a while ago now how they'd actually reintroduced Victorian, essentially, workfare, which was, they brought in these kind of, not apprenticeships, but kind of youth training schemes and things, where basically, or people on the dole being sent to Tesco's to work for their dole money. And what's that? You're giving us, the state is giving a subsidy to Tesco's by giving them basically free workers and paying them, just enough to survive. So we can keep people at home, but do a similar thing that the workhouse did, which is keep them on a starvation wage and farm them out to employers. And the employers don't have to pay for them. The state pays this minimum wage bill. And we've been doing another thing to subsidize wages for a long time, which is this thing called tax credits. Right, which again is a way of letting employers pay below starvation wages, and then the state tops them up so you can just about live. Right, and we say thank you to the state, but it's like the taxpayer is subsidizing the profits of big corporations through these mechanisms. Right, it's like housing benefit; it's a subsidy to landlords.
And I wanted to flag this also to get onto the. We'll jump ahead and back and forth. Why not? The universal basic income. And in terms of what you said about the importance of having, a scientific approach to this, or a scientific socialist approach to this, is that a lot of the things that get sold to us as to help the poor, to help the worker, to help whatever, we're just conduits. So I'm sure most of the people, even, there can be some fraud, whatever. But most of the people that get in this country, I think it's the universal credit, that goes into their bank account and then out. To utilities, to rent, to food. But then it's like, oh, we're giving them this. It's like, no, actually what you're doing is what you just said, is that you're propping up or subsidizing market actors via, it just kind of goes through somebody's bank account. And they can still stay in their apartment, or they can, afford or kind of maybe afford the groceries. But it's just so, when you really think about it, just so nasty.
It's totally nasty. And it also, it's utterly demoralizing for the people involved in terms of their own character and their own life, because they become sponges rather than, actors and agents in their life and in society. And that is a bad position for any person to be in. As Marxists, we always say a person has one mouth to feed, two hands to work. Right? We can produce far more than we need if we're given the opportunity. The problem with capitalism is it's incapable of giving us all useful work. That doesn't mean there isn't useful work to be done. The worst crime under a socialist society is people not being given useful employment, because there's so much that needs doing, and we can easily employ everybody on decent wages, decent conditions, quite short hours, to provide a much better life for everybody, and for people to feel genuinely involved in the life of the productive life, as well as the social life of the country and of the communities. So it's a utter waste, the most abominable waste. really obscene waste of human material that capitalism engenders with this what Marx referred to as the reserve army of labor, which is of course the unemployed, right? And capitalism needs the unemployed. It needs the unemployed to keep the workers, the employed workers, disciplined. On the one hand, it keeps wages low. There's always, if you won't work, I can always find someone else who will work. And also, if there's a sudden need to expand the workforce, you've got people hanging around waiting to be employed. So you can expand and contract as required. So unemployment, mass unemployment, is built into the workings of the capitalist system from two directions. One, because the capitalists impoverish the working class, and then the market kind of shrinks, and people don't have the wherewithal to buy the products, and then the market shrinks some more, and the production shrinks, and so you end up with people unemployed. And because the competition between big businesses creates technical innovations, and the technical innovations make workers redundant. So you have this from different directions. You have unemployment constantly being replenished, if you like, as capitalism progresses. So there's no way to abolish this parasitism and this waste of workers without abolishing capitalism. So the best that the capitalists can come up with in some countries, like in the West, has been to say, well, we can't get rid of unemployment, so we'll pay the unemployed a small wage, not too much, because then being unemployed looks a bit attractive, right? And then they won't come back. Not enough that they don't starve in a ditch, because too many workers starving in a ditch makes the rest of the working class quite angry, right?
And it makes the good people feel bad, or it inconveniences them.
It makes the mass of the working class indignant, actually, if they feel that that's their fate when they fall out of work, is to starve in the ditch. That's gonna make them a lot more militant. So if you can keep the unemployed quiet and out of sight, then that's a good deal. But it was also a way of buying off the militancy of the working class after World War II. But that is, like I said, it's being taken away, and unemployment's becoming less and less survivable for many, many people.
Joti, what's your time frame now? Because I'm fine, but I don't want to. I mean, I could go on and as can you, but I want to be conscious of your time. So how much time do we have here?
We should kind of start to wrap it up.
Okay, good. So we'll have to have her back for part 2. But I want to get through the kind of rubric of bourgeois proletarian forming content. I'm going to combine the next two. In terms of, again, this is my, especially this, I came apart after the Cold War. I started after the shock of fascism, perhaps, and then the Cold War, and then, after the 60s and whatnot. But they have the worker, or the focus on the worker proletariat, both in terms of what the politics and activism is for, and also who's supposed to be doing these things. So it's not just what needs to be done, but who does it and how. And you have the shift from whatever you want to call it, not necessarily, and there's some anti-worker, because the worker gets scolded, the worker doesn't, we don't know the right things or say the right words, or we're racist, or we're this, or we have an authoritarian personality and we like daddies, or whatever it is. The more negative part. And then the part, this kind of, Chantal Mouffe kind of third way, like, well, it could be, there are all kinds of actors. So there's all the oppressed. We have to center the oppressed, center the marginalized, decenter the worker. And that's where you get this kind of, any kind of human right you're working on, any kind of norm you're trying to liberate people from, becomes something that's of the left. And the workers kind of and therefore class has kind of gotten in the mix of it. You also have this thing, the trinity of race. First it was race, gender, and class. Let me see if I can bring this up here, because of how things got so confused, especially people who go through humanities or education. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to find it. So that, you have to look at that race, gender, and class get presented as if they're the same thing. So all these things, instead of one of these things maybe isn't like the other. And then, of course, you got added to it. I'll think of bell hooks. You had the thing when I was going to college that the issue was the focus of our ire is white supremacist, heteronormative, capitalist patriarchy. Yeah. And then you had the matrix of oppression, which you had that. And then you had maybe like ableism and sexuality and maybe body positivity and, you know, all the stuff, furries, trans, all the stuff coming into that. So there's the combination of the decentering of the worker, the decentering of proletarian politics or class, this opening up of either it's wrong to think, it's stupid or backward to think of a quote unquote ahistorical subject or ahistorical or not ahistorical, but historical revolutionary subject, that space needs to become empty. Anything you want to say about that in terms of how it kind of I'm sure I have, you know, where all this stuff came from, how it gets confusing, and how someone who really wants to who wants to be, you know, thinks they're of the left to make sense of all this stuff, from class to class, race, gender, to matrix of oppression, to all the kind of panoply of marginalized people and norms we need to queer. And that's what it means to be a leftist.
Definitely. Well, I would, first of all, I'm sorry, I'm going to do a plug. I wrote this little pamphlet. It's called Identity Politics or Class Politics. It's a very small pamphlet. You can see it's little, that just gives a kind of an overview and a context for all of this that I think helps people to just navigate. So I don't go into detail about all the different stupid strands of idiocy, but to give you a framework that hopefully you can navigate for yourself. So I'll just say that out there first. And if you don't want to, you can buy it from our shop.thecommunists.org. But if you don't want to buy it, you can download it as a PDF from our website as well. So one way or another, you know, the information is there for you if you would like to take a look at that. I would just like to point out that what we've seen in the modern period is the move into academia of struggles which used to be central to the socialist struggle for the emancipation of the working class. So I said earlier about how the real mass women's struggle for liberation is tied to the question of class liberation. And so therefore, the question of women's liberation was a central plank in the socialist program of action. And people who were really serious about fighting for women's equality joined the socialists. And we fight alongside working class men for class liberation, which will also be women's liberation, right? Similarly, you know, the struggle against racism is understood to be the struggle against imperialism. Imperialism needs racism, feeds racism at home and abroad all the time to justify its wars and to keep the population at home divided against itself. So it needs racism. It's endemic to an imperialist system to have racism. So if you want to get rid of racism, you've got to get rid of imperialism, which means fight capitalism, which means join the socialists, right? And fight black and white, fight together against the class system that is destroying all of our lives, right? This is the real content of a really anti-racist or a really women's liberation struggle. What we got was the bourgeoisification of those struggles to separate people who wanted to fight racism and people who wanted to fight for women's liberation from the communists, from the socialists, right? To separate them off into little silos. And we got this we got bourgeois nationalism and bourgeois feminism. And in both cases, what their demands boil down to, instead of trying to get rid of capitalism in unity with all other workers, they separate themselves into a special interest group and say, we need equality in this society. And that becomes their mantra, right? And I've talked earlier about how equality inside capitalist society is a mirage. It's an unattainable dream. So what does it really come down to? What it really comes down to is a fight over words, telling people off for having wrong attitudes within the working class, rather than helping them to see why we have a common struggle. And it's a demand for better off, more educated Black people or better off, more educated women to have access to the highest echelons of careers in the present system. And that's what equality looks like, right? And, you know, this has been a hijacking of our struggle, essentially, and turning it into something completely different. And this is why I do not identify at all as a feminist, right? I am a working class politician, in the sense of, I do working class politics, and the working class politics for women, the battle for women's emancipation is a socialist battle. I'm going to also do a plug for this book from our party, which
Marxism and the Emancipation of Women. Yes.
Yeah. And this documents by women comrades who came a generation before me, and who founded our party, their struggles in the women's movement when it was a truly mass movement, and they were fighting these bourgeois trends. And ultimately, they were not successful because they were a small group, and they were overwhelmed by all the people who were peddling bourgeois nonsense into the movement. Massive working class women who had been mobilized into the women's movement were demobilized by all the crap that was like, burn your bra, kick the oppressor out of your bed. That was literally one of their
wait a minute. Have you seen this stuff by the new thing, Abolish the Family?
Right. So all of this nonsense, of course, turned the working
families are bad, especially those men folk.
So the working class women actually wanted to better their conditions as working class women, and the direction that the movement was going in alienated them, and they were basically demobilized. And the movement became one of petty-bourgeois feminists who basically went into academia, Germaine Greer types, right?
And just on that, because and I know we're wrapping up as we speak, Joti, but this fits into your party and Zara Sultana, when she proudly said that there's no room for quote unquote social conservatism in a socialist party. So it's not enough just to be tolerant of whatever. You have to be super excited and about every niche sexuality, every curiosity that used to be private that's now made into an identity. You have to be super, super excited about that, or F off, socialism is not for you. And I wanted to ask you about this. And again, I think for most people and for myself, it's easy to plot people's cultural the cultural stuff, and then be like, oh, that's left or right. But when it gets into what we've been talking about, when you've been dealing with, in your, and the tradition, then it gets a bit more complicated or obscured, and or this kind of stuff obscures it, and you would say quite by design.
Oh, yeah.
So what would you say? Is it possible to be conservative, to not be super excited about furry, polyamorous, abolish the family types, or is no room for you in the Communist Party?
Of course it's possible. In fact, there's a beautiful quote from Lenin in my little pamphlet where he talks about, and he tells off Clara Zetkin and some other German revolutionaries from about 1918, and says this obsession with sex, he basically says, look, it's putting the cart before the horse. It's a ridiculous thing for a proletarian party to be engaging in when there's actual revolution happening on your doorstep. You've got much more important things to be doing. These are questions for the future, the questions of how will the family resolve itself? How will our relationships resolve themselves? First, you've got to get liberated and then find out how they resolve themselves, right? Now, when it comes to socialist demands, the platform of the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, the party that is trying to help the working class achieve its liberation and build socialism, our core platform is about how do we unite people around the most important demands of the working class. Now, to abolish racism and therefore abolish imperialism, to abolish the oppression of women and therefore class society, these are foundational planks of a Communist Party program. But every prejudice that's held in a society, every little marginalized group or people that feels that there's something,
every kink, good Lord, sorry.
That's not even a marginalized group. That's just a sexual preference. It's got nothing to do with your economic status in society. No. And frankly, it's not something that anybody needs to bloody well know about. The idea that talking about your sexual I'm trying to think of the right proclivities,
Yeah.
is something
Enjoyments.
is something interesting to other people or liberating to yourself. It's utter nonsense, and it's the epitome of individualism, isn't it? We are trying to wage a class struggle to abolish capitalist production relations and instill socialist ones, right? The planned economy. And so the demands of our program are things which will further this aim and unite the working class around this program. We are against workers being discriminated against for any reason, whether it's to do with they're old or disabled or whatever, but that doesn't make it the central plank of our program for the pure reason that you can solve those problems inside capitalist production relations. You can, for example, look what's happened. This society used to be massively homophobic, right? There were lots of laws and prejudice against gay people. Nevertheless, there were plenty of gay people in high positions of power, right? But they had to be hypocritical, and it was, you know, they were officially it was kind of banned and all the rest of it. Those laws have all been overturned. Gay people have got the right to get married, the right to adopt children, all kinds of things. Did that stop capitalism? No. So therefore, gay rights are not a central plank of a Marxist program.
Oh, they're a great market, yeah.
It doesn't change the relations of this society. If our job is to change the relations of society, we have to focus our program on what's going to do that. So we're focused on anti-imperialism. We're focused on uniting the workers against the ruling class. We're not focused on little special interest groups, and we're certainly not focused on sexuality and sexual proclivities. It's utterly irrelevant to our struggle, apart from the commodification of women and children as a market under capitalism. Of course, we have to oppose that. We have to stand against pornography. We have to stand against prostitution.
Big fertility.
These are ultimate crimes against the working class of a class society, and we have to stand against those. But yeah, there's a lot of bourgeois individualism that tries to sell you the idea that prostitution and even paedophilia is somehow.
Are you saying that sex work isn't work?
Right. I am actually. I'm saying that it's not hard work. I'm saying that it's a crime against women, and we have to be opposed to it. And
no, I always think it's when someone asks me about that, I always go ahead.
Something that divides the working class. If you say that prostitution is liberating and acceptable in society.
Who are you to judge the prostitute, Jodi? You prude.
You're basically saying to men, working class, you want men and women to fight together for socialism, but you're saying to the men that they have the right to buy a woman's permission to have sex with her, i.e. to pay to rape her. I mean, just stop and think about that. How does that help us unify the workers to fight together for socialism? It's the opposite, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and I always think because the kind of like, you know, it becomes like, oh, what are you like the body shaming thing? Like if you come and say that, you know, people, all this sugary food and whatnot and exercise is good, somehow you're body shaming people, or who are you to shame a prostitute? And I think one of the things, not to get too far off topic, but I think some people are kind of like boutique people. They think like it's like Julia Roberts or something in Pretty Woman. And what I've always said, not to be a bit, I'll be a bit vulgar to these people who are like sex work is work, especially, you know, is like, okay, tell you what, why don't you go down to the dock or the truck stop and service 5 guys with the first 5 guys who want to pay you £10 for you know what, and then come back and tell us about how sex work is work.
And what a liberating choice that was.
Nobody has done it yet.
Of course they
I really, that's the point. I don't really want them to.
No,
it's just this.
And they're not going to unless they're forced to, which is the whole point, isn't it?
Yeah. And last thing, before we wrap up, because this is going on right now, this kind of mind game, and you mentioned before that the serious socialist or communist parties that have the education, the tradition, the plan, whatnot, don't get invited or don't get much press attention at all. But I'm sure you've picked up on the fact that already it's kind of, I made this meme like the UK lefty and is looking at Zach Polanski and Jeremy Corbyn or U Party is kind of looking at the UK left like, what? You forgot us already? And we've been sold that this guy somehow is, the Greens had a good time at their conference. They feel radical. You know, they said the idea of as a terrorist organization. They said they want to abolish landlords, something which kind of means into like some sort of rent credit. But to end on this about what to make of, is it true the Green Party has bold politics? And why is a lot of the press having such a good time? Why is this guy getting his moment in the sun?
Well, it absolutely isn't true, is it? I mean, fundamentally, whenever the Green Party takes a really radical turn, and when it was first founded, it presented itself as being radical and far left of Labour. And the roots of its politics are in anarchism, they're in Proudhonism. Fundamentally, they're in capitalism with kinder characteristics. And it's just a circus to keep people busy. That's why the ruling class will regularly wrap it up and throw it at you as, oh, you're looking for alternatives. Here's one. And look, the man in front, it looks quite pretty, doesn't he? So that helps. You know, he's good in a suit. He makes a nice speech. Oh, he said abolish landlords. Well, great. Yes, I'm in favor of abolishing landlords and all rentiers and all owners of capital. How are we going to do that then? You know, you're not going to do it by passing a law through the British Parliament, no more landlords, right? There's no chance that you can do that, right? Because landlordism is the epitome of capitalism, right? Taking rents because you own stuff. That's how capitalism works, right? So what do they mean when they say, you know, when you get to the nuts and bolts of it, how are they going to achieve anything? Their program is unachievable within the terms they've set for themselves. And if you wanted to achieve any of the good things these people say they stand for, you've got to go root and branch and abolish the system, which of course they do not stand for. And the Green Party, let's not forget, the Green Party in England and Wales, at least, I'm not sure about Scotland, supports the Ukraine war and came out.
Oh yeah, he's for NATO. Yeah, he likes NATO.
Policy about NATO, right? So they support NATO. So they're entirely a party of imperialism and defending British imperialism whilst wrapping it up, you know, in some, you know, nice little phrases to attract people who are falling out of love with Labour and starting to draw the right conclusion that it doesn't matter who you vote for, you get the same outcome. So the idea is you give them your party, give them the Green Party, give them reform, make them feel like something new is happening when actually what you're giving them is the
reboot,
repackaged same that we've been having for the last, you know, however long.
Yeah, we have a saying in the States, no matter who you vote for, you get John McCain.
Right.
You know?
Whatever party wins the election, the ruling class is ultimately the winner. They stay in power, right? So that's the question we have to address. And
I just wanted to wrapping it up now. When I first saw that, and because people get mad at you, like, oh, you're just a buzzkill. Like, look, like in what you just said, I just wanted to put, because my first thing, again, I'm not as well versed in the UK situation as I should be. But I thought when I saw that, I'm like, well, don't you have to get rid of the monarchy first if you're going to get rid of abolish the landlords? And then I was thinking back to your comrade Alex McKay, and we were having a laugh, like how many lettuces or how many Liz Trusses would your party coalition last? And because and not because we and to I'll paraphrase what Alexander said and get your comment, and then we'll say our till we meet agains. Is that another problem with this Green Party thing or the Your Party thing or the momentum is that either they don't know what they're talking about, or they're being or they're on purpose not preparing people for what that would actually mean. You know, so let's say if you really wanted, let's say that Jack Polanski thinks that if he were to somehow get enough votes and he was the head of this coalition against fascism, and they decide, oh no, they think they're really in control. Let's start abolishing landlords. What would happen? You know, when the landlords try to abolish you or the banksters or whatever, and the markets start to go crazy and people get scared, then what? You know, it's like, it's just because then people get disillusioned and think, oh, you really can't do that.
They do.
They get, I don't know, to use the expression, they get the cart before the horse. They're starting where they want to end rather than how to get there, I guess.
Yes. They don't really understand what the real problem is. And that's really the point of most of these, you know, kind of very astroturfed mass movements, is to keep the indignant part of the population that's starting to want to mobilize and really change things, keep them busy on something that can go nowhere, right? That's the point of it. And I tend to believe, it's not just that they get astroturfed in terms of, promoted and a narrative created. I'm afraid I think that they are infiltrated from the start, if not very often the leaders themselves, but if not, then all the people around them advising them are basically state assets, and they are part of networks of people that are connected to various parts of the state, in order to make sure they present a program that fundamentally doesn't question the root causes of the problem, that keeps people hoping and believing that there's a way to reform the system into being fair and into delivering a better life for them. And yes, you're right. Very often, even then, the limited demands they're making, because we're in a time of such deep economic crisis, even those demands are not demands that the ruling class would really accept being put into practice. So this whole thing with Corbyn, it was like his demands, some of them, renationalize the railways and the water system. The Financial Times was running long investigations over how this would probably be a good idea, right? Because there's a big section of bourgeois society which is suffering from how bad privatization has been, and a discussion about should some of it now be reversed. There's constant pieces in the FT about whether or not it's now time to start taking some of these privatized things back into public ownership in such a way that we can run them for the benefit, because business needs some of these services too, right? So some of his program was okay, but what was not okay was his official opposition to NATO. Well, they got him to turn around on that. His official opposition to Israeli Zionism. Well, he won't openly come out and say he's an anti-Zionist, because he actually isn't. But having been seen as the official left Labour friend of Palestine for 30, 40 years, it was kind of impossible for him to do the kind of U-turn he would need to do to be an advocate of Israeli suppression of the Palestinian people in office. And that I think was really the big impediment to Jeremy Corbyn being allowed to win an election and pretend to deliver on one or two things like renationalizing the water or the railways, right? Which they're sort of half doing, to the extent that they want to anyway, right? But the few things that were really likely to upset the ruling class, they could have got him to turn around on, but the Zionism thing was the thing I think that was the big impediment. And I think really it would be a good education for people. It's annoying that they still need this after we've got so much experience, but it would be quite a good education for people to see in practice what would happen if Mr. Zach Polanski got into it's Polanski, isn't it? Have I got his name right?
But you're Zach Polanski. Yeah, it's not his real name. It's his. Well, I mean, it's his legal name. But anyway, that's another story. Of course, Zach Polanski sounds kind of, mysterious. Yeah, Zach.
Anyway,
I don't know.
Zach was to get into
another and a UK. I'm sorry, just a US example is the Zorhan Mondami, who looks to be. It looks like he's probably going to, unless there's some, outside electoralism shenanigans, which is possible. He's polling like 15-20% against what was that guy's name? Oh, whoever the guy who was, I can't remember. Anyway, Cuomo. But already, even though he's doing so good in the polls and he got a lot of support because of his principal position on Palestine, he still is sliding more and more into this, just as one example, his statement yesterday about October 7th didn't mention Palestinians at all and started off with Hamas's attacks, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that could be another example. He actually could win in New York, and then we'll see what actually happens if he goes totally
to the ruling class, isn't he? He's auditioning to the ruling class. Let me in. I'll be a safe pair of hands. Yes, I'll say the odd radical thing, but I'm not really against your interests. So he's made statements against Cuba and Venezuela, statements against Palestinian resistance, statements, so he's actually making it clear. And of course, he supported the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad's Syria. So, and of course he supports NATO's war against Russia in Ukraine, right? So where's the radicalism actually in any of his positions? He's there to.
It's his name,
right?
And his pedigree. Yeah, I think his parents are. Anyway, that's another story. But no, he's good on paper, and he can talk well.
It will be interesting to see. I mean, it's going to, as far as I'm concerned, you're going to see AOC and Bernie all over again, aren't you? But let's say that Zach got into number 10. You know, with the Green Party majority, right? Which is never going to happen.
Let's dream big. Let's dream big.
A parliamentary supermajority for the Green Party, and Zach
it's a green wave.
had parliament, and he was in office. It would be a good education for people to see that he would be just as much a servant of British imperialism as any of the others. He's already made it clear. His party's made it clear. It's part of why he's getting promoted, because he's already told the ruling class, yes, I'm your man, by supporting NATO, supporting its wars, you know, supporting their version of green politics, which is just give subsidies to monopoly capital, and they'll pretend that they're doing things to help the environment when they're not really. They're just propping up their profit margins.
Yeah. And on that note, I think we've covered a lot about clarifying why the left-right binary or spectrum is problematic, because it tends to be the left wing of liberalism and the right wing of liberalism, where left bourgeois, white bourgeois, even though in the parlance of it, especially in the United States at this time, and maybe also in the UK, it's like anything that's not Republican is far left, you know, which is like, you know, Schumacher and Pelosi, Biden, so these crazy lefties. Although Kamala was on a talk show, they wheeled her out again, and she was calling Trump a communist dictator. But we'll get into that at a different time. Thank you so much. This has been great. Please do check out, I'll put Joti's information in the video comments when I get to that later today. Please do like, subscribe, follow, whatever. I think if everything's working out right, I'm on so many platforms now that I don't understand. I got a Kick thing going on now. I think it's Twitch, Rumble, YouTube, X. If it all worked, we'll find out later. But please do like, follow, subscribe. We'll definitely have Joti back, or I'll try to get her back as soon as I can. I know she's in demand, as you can tell by listening to her. She knows her stuff. Please do check out thecommunist.org. On X, it's X. I'll let you say it. It's X at Joti to Gaza.
Joti to Gaza with a number 2, yeah. With
a number 2 and all small letters, but I'll have that in the thing. Do check out her latest 2 podcasts with Julian Vigo on Savage Minds. And are you doing the weekly thing? Is it a weekly thing with you and Garland?
It kind of goes up and down depending on how busy I am, but in general, I'm with him on a Tuesday. It's
like an imperialist report, yeah? And the last thing I want to say, because I forgot to mention it, and then I'm really going to let you go. Of course, I can't. You could leave on your own. Is that we mentioned how imperialism is a lot of, for both the UK and the United States, but not just them, but we use those 2 as examples. One of their main exports is capital overseas, and they want to get a return on that. You have to understand that to also understand the foreign policy, the military policy, all this type of stuff. But why that also matters in terms of the workers of the world unite is that all that capital that's that could be reinvested or kept within the national boundaries or whatever regional boundaries gets taken out and put off everywhere. And then the people in power, again, what we alluded to, they get a lot of great tax policies from when they quote unquote repatriate, because they want that capital moving. So a lot of that is also why over time, even though it doesn't get discussed about this a lot from the quote unquote left or alternative media or the media, is that's why you have such a steady decline of living standards and deindustrialization, all of that. I wanted to make sure that we connected that before we leave, that that there's a connection between the conditions in a lot of places in the imperial core, for lack of a better word, with all the capital that's getting invested or distributed all over the place for the best returns.
Totally. And, you know, Britain being the first country of industrial capitalism was the first to begin the process of deindustrializing via the export of capital. So export of capital is the key economic indicator of an imperialist economy, that they stop exporting manufactured goods to the world and they start just exporting capital to bring back profits. So they've built a machinery for sucking the wealth out of the world. But simultaneously, while they're doing that, they are exporting all the manufacturing jobs. So increasingly, and because that started in Britain in the 19th century, right? This process has been going on for like 150 years. So no wonder it is when you look around you now, you find it very hard to find a person you know who's engaged in making something. And yet we're using things all the time, but we don't make any of it. It's a very demoralized society that produces, because essentially our entire economy has become parasitic, and most of us are paid to either do service jobs or to somehow tend to or help the machinery of financial looting of the rest of the world, right? So we have a very parasitic economy through no fault of our own. This is the inevitable workings of a capitalist economy on a global scale. And the only way to reverse that now and bring back a productive and meaningful economy to Britain is by abolishing imperialism and setting up reindustrializing the country on a socialist basis.
Great. And on that note, Joti, thank you. Thank you, comrade. I'll let you go. I'm sure you have many things, many battles to fight and papers to write and all that stuff. I hope we can do this again sometime. Everybody, check out her deets and the details below. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Maybe I'll see you at a meeting at some point. Who knows?
Yeah, that would be great.
Take care. Thank you, Joti.
Take care.
All right. So that was fun. That was a good one. Okay, people, Joti has to go. She gave me, she promised, she allotted me an hour and a half and ended up giving me 2. So I can't complain. I need to take a 5-minute break and then I'll come back and I'll go through. I see we have some questions and comments. I'm sorry you don't get Joti's response, but you can get mine. I'm just going to pause this. Well, not pause it. I'm going to keep the stream on. I'm going to put on some music, and I'll be back in 5 minutes to go through the comments and questions and put them on the screen. This conversation that I've had with Joti will, within a week or so, I'll make it into an article format and put on Substack and flesh it out a bit. So your comments and questions could play a role in that. So please do, at the moment though, housekeeping, please do like, follow, subscribe, all that stuff. If you're watching this on Substack or Rumble or YouTube or X, I appreciate that. Also, yeah. And for the rest of the housekeeping, we can do that in a bit. Again, I'll be back in about 5 minutes to go through the comments and questions. For those of you who want to stick around for that and are fine with just getting my response in addition to, or rather than Joti's and mine. So I am going to start some music here. And I'm sorry, I don't have, I have a clip, but then it'd be the same clip over and over again. I guess maybe that's all right. We'll see. But anyway, I'll be back in 5 minutes to go over the questions and comments. In what way does your party, and Corbyn and Sultana, misrecognize the terrain? We'll give them the benefit of the doubt that they say what they mean, offering kind of a fantasy instead of a strategy that's really going to be able to make any dent in any long-term change that gets us out of this kind of declining empire, to plug Alexander and Kit's Decline and Fall.
Well, the objective conditions that you mentioned, which is a late-stage imperialist economy, Britain is heavily financialized, more so than even the United States is. There's much less of a manufacturing base. There's much less of an actual productive base upon which you could actually properly base like a reform program that social democrats used to want to implement. What you've got is a parasitic economy. You've got a non-productive economy where when the government tries to make investments into, say, infrastructure building, the budget balloons beyond all recognition. Money drains off through various different parasitic companies and entities at every single stage, because in the post-70s period referred to by academics as the neoliberal period, the politicians shouting about taking on bureaucracy creates many bureaucracies, but privatizes them all. And so every single investment program becomes entirely inefficient. Now, if you're going to outline like a big capital spending program, which is what Corbyn says he's in favor of, and you don't change the way that the state is organized and run, well, then you're just going to pour good money after bad. I'll use the example of the NHS budget. Everybody argues about how much money they put into it. But what Corbyn did mention briefly when he's Labour leader, to be fair, but not enough, was how much money drains out through privatizations and semi-private and fully private bureaucracies. The British state is structured to redistribute money into various parasitic entities, private companies, with the banks playing the leading guiding role. Now, how are you going to reform that? To use Laura's example of housing, the reason why they run scared of actually doing anything about housing is because if you'd say we will return to a mass council house building program, that's the end of the property bubble. Now, if you're going to pop that bubble, that means very rich people are going to be very, very angry. Also, a lot of other things are invested in the property bubble, are continually expanding, like pension funds. So if you're going to go near that, then you better have a good plan for when these people who control a lot of money and a lot of influence launch their fight back. Or do to Corbyn, for instance, what they did to the beloved, the late, the unlamented Liz Truss.
In what way does your party, and Corbyn and Sultana, misrecognize the terrain? We'll give them the benefit of the doubt that they say what they mean, offering kind of a fantasy instead of a strategy that's really going to be able to make any dent in any long-term change that gets us out of this kind of declining empire, to plug Alexander and Kit's Decline and Fall.
Well, the objective conditions that you mentioned, which is a late-stage imperialist economy, Britain is heavily financialized, more so than even the United States is. There's much less of a manufacturing base. There's much less of an actual productive base upon which you could actually properly base like a...
Here's another quote from Ms. Sultana. If we're going to change society, we have to center the most marginalized people. Yeah, my theory is that in general, that you have this PMC or NGO professional class, and then you have kind of their favorite lumpen of the year, and they go together. And it's like, look, we're going to showcase, I don't know, furry, polyamorous, non-binary people, or we're going to find the most matrix of oppressed person, and we're going to shine a light on them, and we're going to raise their voice while we, put a softer face on the capitalist machine. And another thing on this idea that the more inclusive you are, the better. The more irons in the fire, the more mixer in the drink, the more potent the political force. And I think that's ass backwards. But what do you two think on any of that? Or feel free to just pretend I said whatever allows you to make an important point. That's always an option.
Well, Zara Sultana's running a bad photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of the original writings of those who founded Euro-communism, which is the movement that emerged post-60s amongst the Western European communist parties where they started to decenter working class struggle and bring in all these other things, not as expressions of class politics, but freestanding. So you bring in environmentalism, but it's not the environmentalism of the working class. It's just the kind of environmentalism that ultimately morphs into the Green Party and NGOs. You bring in certain varieties of racial politics, but again, it's filtered through essentially like a declassed thing. So it's like, we're now going to represent black people as if there's no class division, you know, amongst the black population.
Well, then us white people just go around and say we're sorry about that and feel really bad about it.
Feel bad, move or don't. But the point about it is, if you look at the Zara Sultana's tweets and Corbyn's, to be fair, because he's no better, they'll mention like a strike every now and again. They'll pick one out to talk about that the trade union bureaucracy is pushing. And they'll say, oh, we want better laws for workers, that kind of thing. We want more trade union rights. But that'll then go alongside like trans rights now, or like we want justice for the Palestinians. They won't really say what that means, but also we need to, stop the Uyghur genocide, or maybe the trans genocide.
Free Tibet.
Free Tibet.
Back to the feudal hours, baby.
You just bring back the Dalai Lama in his somewhat dubious ways with children, because that's what freedom really.
Richard Gere would not steer us wrong.
So Americans are really stupid. There's no way around that. They're very stupid people. It's not like the paradox of saying a cretin said all cretins are liars. No, this is statistics. We have a population that every year the literacy continues to decline. So saying they're stupid is an actual fact. And you can shame Americans into positions. They go with the flow. They're not what they like to pretend to be, where they're like, we're rebels and we do all this. No, you guys follow everything the mainstream says. Just cattle.
And this is the thing that gets me about RBN. This is a psyop, this is a psyop, this is a psyop. It's like, how much more of a psyop is there than gender ideology? They got you to go along that men can be women and women can be men, and the trans kids and non-binary and all. You went along with that. Like nobody's business. They can't see it or don't want to see it. It's like they're a materialist Marxist. There's no more fundamental expression of extreme idealism, subjective idealism, than this gender identity stuff. I'm a woman if I say so.
And I've said this before. This is a class issue in and of itself, because you have a rooted attack on females. You can't sit there and say, oh, I'm against prostitution, I'm against the exploitation of women. But hey, I'm all for this one group of guys that decide they're all, women. And for some reason, we all have to couple them. That's what kills me. But I get it. You have a lot of black socialists that the way they look at it is, if I'm willing to give on this issue, then, I'm willing to give on some sort of discrimination against my group, And so I think that's the framing. So Americans are really.
Oh, I'm a small little dot. Hold on. There I am. Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me. So let's see. Joti had to go. She already gave me 2 hours when originally I was promised an hour and a half, so I can't complain. I just want to go over any non-trolling comments and questions, and I will respond to them. And if anything is Joti specific, I will forward them onto her, and we can try to address them the next time that we are on. So I'm just going to check out this here. Let me go up again. Let's see. So let's see. So arcane, eclectic, Joti Brar is fantastic. Yes, she is. She's good. She knows her stuff and is the real deal. Hi, Jerry Jacobs. I used to believe that 20th century capitalism had moved far away from Marx, Engels, and Lenin, but no, it's all there in the writing. Yeah, it's of course. I mean, there's the difference between the method the historical studies and the theory. Yeah, but the theory, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing else that's topped its understanding of the mechanisms of capitalism and the dialectical process, etc. Yet, and I mean, obviously, since we're still in some form of capitalist political economy, until that's no longer the case, I can't imagine Marxism, has to stay alive. You don't just treat it like a guru, like a sacred text, but that it wouldn't be central to any kind of class politics that's focused on the majority of the people. Let's see. Distorting Marxism to accommodate bourgeois politics. Yeah, it must have been about the revisionism and whatnot. Let's see. Jerry Jacobs' foreign aid is also part of it. Yes. If I to take it when we were talking about imperialism and also the various forms and content that can take. So foreign aid, for example, sounds good. We're going to give, there's poorer countries and regions. We're going to give them, or either give them aid money, or oftentimes it comes in terms of loans with conditionalities, or share with them technology, etc. But if you trace that, and Jason Hinkle has written a lot about this, when you can actually trace the flows of both foreign aid, as in like literal aid, like here you go, and also rent, and also loans that goes in to whatever you want to call it, the third world, the global south, and to what comes out of that back into imperial core countries. And of course, not distributed equally for everybody, but that goes back into that. So they get a lot of return on their investment, so to speak. And also, it makes the more of the population in those places, especially the kind of maybe professional middle classes in particular, more and more aligned and connected to various, either directly to foreign NGOs. And also they start talking about the discourse. There's a reason why if you go into a lot of NGOs, even working in microcredit in villages in, I don't know, Bangladesh or India, they'll start talking about human capital, and you got to, even though there's small bits of human capital, you can invest in it and this type of thing. And those are discourses that come out of academia and think tanks and whatnot. So yeah, foreign aid is also plays into that. So it's about dependency, and it's about and also another thing that happens that can happen is that when, for example, money that gets sent to a place then gets used by that place to buy goods from the sending country. Yeah, which of course, so again, it's kind of like this conduit. It does go through the receiving country or the receiving sector or group, but a lot of that goes back, ends up back in the people who have sent the aid or gave them the loan or etc. Let's see. Nautical. Oh, great! I finally get to watch one live. Hi, Nautical. I'm glad you're here. Yeah, it's hard with the time zones. Yeah. We didn't cover the definition of reactionary. Well, that's true. Next time, but she did do revisionism. And reactionary, as I understand it, is this, from the point of view, I'll keep in the Marxist vein, is that capitalism is an alive thing, or the political economy, the social formation, the means, the mode of production, whatever you want to call it, is a living entity. It's moving and changing, and things are happening. And a reactionary, largely definition, as I understand it, is someone that wants to stop that from happening. So it's kind of a bit like conservatism, but more about just reacting to what's manifesting from kind of the normal, the structural workings of the capitalist economy, but wanting to block that or thwart that, and not address it as such, but react to it in a non-Marx, in a non class focused way, rambling a bit. Immigration is one example. So I would say that a reactionary reaction or take on immigration is to hyper focus on the kind of clash of civilization or cultural issues. You know, the immigration is immigration is bad because whatever the Islam and Western and Christendom or whatever just aren't going to mix, or you get a lot of focus on whenever an immigrant from a particular group in particular commits some sort of crime or can be presented as committing some sort of crime, they want to hyper focus on that to be like, look, that's why we're into immigration, because these people, you know, are so criminal or barbaric or whatever. So it's a reactionary response to that, rather than, and people can have all kinds of feelings. You know, we have our preferences, of course, and freedom of association. And for most of humanity, I think there's a reason why people feel comfortable with people who, you know, look and talk and have the same kind of cultural practices as they do. But to look at immigration in a non-reactionary way would be to look at the push and pull of the economic factors. So what are the political and economic factors that push people out of certain places and attract them to others? And to look at it that way rather than, oh, it's a cultural division, or it's the Great Replacement, or what all the other things that people are trying to understand these demographic changes that are going on, whether the objective ones or the ones that are fanned out to a great deal. And I know that I'll use my country as an example, the United States. There's a lot of talk now, if you look on social media, about, you know, Islam is terrible, Islam this, Muslims are taking over the country. You have politicians passing anti-Sharia laws. But if you actually look at that, regardless of what you think or what a person's understanding is of Islam, which in itself is an abstraction, because, you know, there's lots of different it's not like there's one type of Islam or one type of a Muslim faith or practice, but the percentage of the population in the United States that says they're Muslim is like 1.34%. And of course, it gets used as code for race, but people tend to forget that, well, anybody can become a Muslim. You know, Muhammad Ali became a Muslim. He went from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, etc. But to focus on that rather than what are the political and economic processes and reasons for why things are getting getting more and more precarious particularly for working class and poor areas, who quite rightly see, like I'll use Chicago for an example. There's a lot of African-American residents of Chicago that aren't happy about all the immigrants that have been what they would call dumped there, and they have been. So they get dumped not around and, you know, distributed out, but they get put into the poor areas of Chicago that tend to be have a higher proportion of African-American and Latinos residents. And then they see these recent immigrants getting help with housing, being, schools being turned into shelters and this type of thing. And they're like, well, what the heck, you know? And that can easily get fanned into people, into a racist and a culture clash, and people who are on this, who are being used and abused or excluded by the same economic and political policies, focusing on each other as the enemy and the problem rather than the broader system. So I would say that is more kind of a reactionary response to immigration, rather than, you know, applying a political economic approach, let alone in particular a Marxist one. So Bishi Barnaby, there's a cliche: the right looks for converts while the left looks for traitors, a clear marker that someone has no knowledge of class's history. Okay. Good comment. Jerry Jacobs, it was a bad day when Thatcher sold off the council houses. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, and on that note too, that again, it gets sold is, and I don't know what was going on in the UK that particular time. I was, uh, I was again growing up in the States, so I had the Reaganomics, which of course are similar to Thatcheromics, the neoliberals, all this type of stuff. But the idea that ownership society, that people should be able to buy the homes and that the market's always better. And of course, other people have talked about how when you have less and less social housing, council housing, you get a housing market that more and more is controlled by not just the property owners, the large property owners, but also the financiers, right? Because they get to decide who they're going to loan money to build the housing or buy it, and they also get to decide who they're going to loan money to be able to afford to get a mortgage. And they keep a certain amount of artificial scarcity of that. You don't have the competition or the option of social private council housing. Is a big contributor to the ongoing price bubble. And of course, the more people, I can't really blame people for not wanting this housing bubble to break when they've seen the people who've been lucky enough to get onto the housing ladder and get onto it earlier rather than later, who've seen their property go up and up and up. Yeah. And when that all comes crashing down, that's another thing that you don't really hear the Greens talking about when they talk about abolish landlordism. When you really start to undo that and break it down, how are you going to prepare people and what are you going to do for the turbulence of that? Because you can't just go from what you have now to there being an abundance of council housing, unfortunately. Jerry Jacobs, Marx, Engels, Lenin Institute did a good analysis of NATO in last night's live stream. Cool, yeah. Good to check that out. Important to remember that it was working class struggle in the Donbass that brought Russia to this point. True. Jerry agrees with you. Let's see. Finn Masterson, both Communist China and the Soviet Union were provided the same veto. Also, are you implying that the Soviets boycotted the UN in 1950 as a reaction to the Korean crisis? I'll have to forward that on to her. I cannot answer that question. Finn, let's see. Finn is, let's see what he says. I'll put it up here, though. The KPA launched its invasion of South Korea with the patronage of Joseph Stalin. Okay, that, again, I'll have to forward. I'm not privy to that history. Okay, in terms of the Afghan thing, I don't think it's a provocative statement that the Mujahideen was basically organized and supported by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and they of course recruited people from various tribal niches and communities in Afghanistan, and that once that was done, once that war was over, there was a power vacuum, and the Taliban came out on top. So it is true that the role of the U.S. in Afghanistan. And the point I was making with that, with relating it to al-Jilani, was that the fickleness of groups and actors that go from being terrorists to freedom fighters to forces of democracy, et cetera, and the carnage that gets left behind. So that was the point of that. The other intricacies, we'll have to wait. Let's see. So let's see. Finn Masterson has U.S. support for Mujahideen only developed well into the Soviets' 9 year of Afghanistan, which killed. Yeah, no one's saying that. At least on today's stream, we didn't really get into what the Soviet Union did in Afghanistan. The point was from the point of view of the United States and the Western powers. And I don't think it's a controversial statement to be that they wanted to thwart they were on the side of those who were fighting, who were on the opposition of the Soviet Union for obvious reasons, the Cold War, and they wanted to get the Soviet Union in the quagmire there, and they had no problem supporting and organizing and arming people who would later, they would say, we have to have the global war on terror to stamp out. I mean, that's true. You can just look through the figure. I mean, you can trace that through the relationship and the categorization of Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen and the American press. And you can look at the same thing with the al-Jilani character. So that was the point I was making. Let's see, talking to each other. So Bishi and Finn are talking about that, but I will forward that on because again, I'm not an the intricacies of the Afghanistan war, the Soviet Afghan war, and the Mujahideen and all of that, and how yeah, I will forward that on, and maybe someone can respond to you in greater detail about that. But it's quite clear that the Taliban was the one that won the power struggle after the power vacuum that happened after that conflict ended, and both the Soviet Union and then the United States lost interest what was going on there, at least from my recollection and press coverage, until 9/11 happened. All right, so let's see. Jerry Jacobs, thank you, comrades. Thank you for tuning in. Bishi, awesome stream. Thank you. And Thomas Wolf, take care. Okay, so that's it. All right, so thank you for tuning in. I hope that this is the not the last time that I get a bit of Joti's time. She's fantastic. I would like to have her come back on for a stream that just focused on feminism. There's an episode I want to have looking at the problematic or maybe obscene underside when you have that feminism can intersect with quite easily, it seems, with fascism, Zionism, imperialism, Orientalism, all kinds of isms. I've seen feminists or feminists say the most eye-melting, racist, ignorant stuff, particularly since October 2nd or October 7th, day one. Hopefully she can come back for that. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. Please do like, subscribe, follow, depending on the platform that you're watching this on. If you have a suggestion for a Morbid Symptoms topic or guest, book review, etc., please do let me know. And on that note, take care, everyone. I will turn on my outro video. It gives bit more information about where you can find us. See you next time.